Today we are going to look at Prophet Hosea under the title of God's Love. Hosea name means God saves or God delivers, and you can see here relationship with the name of Jesus. The key word to understanding of his message is covenant, and the best image to describe the covenant is of course marriage. What is opposite to faithfulness in marriage? Adultery. What is opposite to faithfulness in covenant? Idolatry. And so, worshipping any other gods, Baalim or Astarte, the local gods of the Palestine, and even political alliances are seen as adultery and prostitution. The destruction of Samaria, for example, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, that took place in year 722 before Christ, is seen as punishment for people's idolatry. As in Jewish law, man had a right to send away his adulterous wife, so God sends away his people, allowing other gods and nations to reign over them. However, there is always hope of restoration of the relationship. Hosea's times. He was married, had 3 children, and was familiar with agricultural life. He began his prophetic ministry like Amos. So those who haven't watched the video on the prophet Amos, please refer to that video to get the wider picture. The northern kingdom of Israel is prosperous, economy is booming, but in such moment, God sends 2 of his prophets, Amos and Hosea, to tell the people that they are heading for disaster. The prophet also saw the rise to power of Assyrian Empire, the ruthless conquerors of the nations around them. And unfortunately, because the people didn't listen to the prophets, in the year 722, as I mentioned already, Assyria destroyed Samaria and the northern kingdom of Israel. Problems seen by the prophet. Number 1, no legitimate king in the country. If in the kingdom of Judah, in Jerusalem, there was one dynasty, the dynasty of David, unfortunately, in the northern kingdom, there was no one dynasty like in Judah. Kings were replaced by other kings through revolts and bloodshed, assassination, killing, terrible when we read the story portrayed in the first and second Kings. God tells very clear that they are not chosen by him. Second problem we already mentioned was forsaking God for other gods, for idols. Third one, also present in the book of Amos, was corruption and violence. And finally, we have political factions, one for Egypt and one for Assyria. In those times, alliance with a nation meant acknowledgement of that nation's deities. So if you submit yourself to a powerful nation, you have to accept also their gods. Therefore, alliance with Assyria or Egypt would compromise Jewish monotheism, Jewish faith in one God. Interestingly, the twofold punishment seemed to indicate that those who opted for Egypt would end up in Egypt, and those who opted for Assyria would end up in Assyria. Let's see how prophet tells that in his own language. So if we go to Hosea chapter 9, we will find this passage. They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, the promised land, but Ephraim, another name for Israel, shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. So this is very clear how the judgment will be related to their own political alliances. Like a husband deserted by his wife. The story of Hosea is really perplexing, interesting, whatever we can put. How was he able to realize deep feelings of God for his people? It is because God's experience was reenacted in his personal life, in his own marriage, with love, frustration, and reconciliation. And here is his life story. He was told by the Lord to marry a girl named Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim. Her name means completion and is referred as the fulfilling up of the measure of idolatry, which refers to the idolatry of the kingdom of Israel. Gomer was the daughter of Diblaim, whose name signifies double layers of grape cake. Those cakes were offered in a sacrifice to Astarte, the goddess of fertility and sexual love. Thus, she became a symbol of her people. It is a shocking request indeed. Did the prophet love that woman or was just obedient to God? Was she a harlot at the time of their marriage or she became a harlot later? Thus, was God giving the prophet an insight into the future of their marriage? The names of the kids are also symbolic. The first boy, Jezreel, the name refers to a place known from the first book of Kings. There, the king and the queen of Israel, Ahab and Jezebel, through the hands of corrupt judges, murdered innocent man Naboth the Jezreelite. It is worth to read that story. It is worth to read that story in the book of Kings 21, 1 to 16, because it is first story where we see the corrupted power that influenced judges who then administrate unjust verdict. Then we had God who condemns the action and foretold the punishment of the king and the queen farther, the same book. So the name of the boy Jezreel predicts the end of Israel. The daughter, Loruhama, no mercy or no giving mercy, means that God's mercy gives way to his just judgment. Finally, the second son, Loami, means not my people. God cuts his relationship with the people. This will be very important later for the New Testament writers, for St. Peter and Paul, talking about the mission to the Gentiles. Going back to the story of Hosea, the wife ran after somebody else whom she loves more than her husband, Hosea. We see here symbol of Israel running after idols whom they love more than their own God. It seems that she became a slave. Hosea brought her from slavery, but did not have any relationship with her. She was polluted by her adultery. Thus, the marriage was not fully renewed. Gomer has to stop running after her lover, then only marriage can be fully restored. Thus, we see Hosea's marriage as a prophetic act of recreating or repeating events in the history of Israel. But it could also be a lesson, an illustration to educate Hosea in the understanding of divine sensibility. His own experience, seen in the light of what was going on around him, led him to the realization of God's emotion, his broken heart. Like a husband deserted by his wife. The prophet describes God falling in love with Israel, but it was not mutual love. Let's again look at Bible, Hosea chapter 11. What do we find there? In chapter 11 we read, "When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt I called my son. But the more they were called, the more they went away. they kept sacrificing to Baals and burning offering to idols. So you can imagine how God felt. God seems not giving up. His passionate love pursues Israel in hope to win her back. But the people are blind. They cannot see the expression of God's love. When God's patience runs out, the end will be a destruction. Blessing of fertility and prosperity was considered to be the domain of the local gods of the land, called the Baalim, the givers of wool and flocks, of oil and wine, of grain, vines, and fig trees. People could not realize that it was God who provided them with all these blessings. But those gods demanded in return for their blessing human sacrifices. And that was the big problem. If we go to Psalm 106, Psalm 1:6, 36, we read, "They served their idols, who became a snare to them. They sacrificed their sons and their daughters to demons. They poured out innocent blood, the blood of their sons and daughters, whom they sacrificed to the idols of Canaan, and the land was polluted with blood." So here we have the difference between idols and the true God. Because what God really demanded was totally different things. He demanded righteousness and justice, love and mercy, faithfulness and attachment. He was the Lord of nature and the master of history at all times. So he was the one providing them with all the blessing. And yet the people were and are probably today fascinated by the cult of Baal and Astarte. What made those local gods so attractive? Probably these two things. They seem to be more comprehensible than the invisible God. Perhaps even more closer. And they seem to be more easily approached and appeased. But is that really the truth? And is the price worthy? God is hurt, so he will fall upon them like a lion. He waited for conversion. He wanted to show them mercy, but his hope was fading. The broken heart of God. Love is the deepest emotion for God's people. Again, if we go back to Hosea chapter 11, which we look already at, so we have there this beautiful statement in verse 8. "How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Adamah? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender." God is not like a man. His steadfast love is always there. So he doesn't want to be abandoned. He pleads his case and waits for the favorable response, return, and reconciliation. God dreams about reunion. His gifts for the bride are righteousness, justice, kindness, and mercy. Will the bride return? Will she accept such gifts? But also it is important to mention that God's love for his people is not blind, that excuses every fault. It is the love that wants to see his people holy. And one more thing, the sin of the people have bad influence also on nature. Here, for the first time, we see how ecology and morality are being connected together. So, verse 4, chapter 4 in Hosea, we see 1 to 2, we see how the people, through their sins, are destroying the land. So, verse 3 we read, "Therefore the land mourns, and all who dwell in it languish, and all the beasts of the field, and the birds of the heavens, and even the fish of the sea are taken away." Ecology and morality cannot be separated. If we really do care about creation, we have to also change the way we live on the moral level. You do not know your God. That was the central claim of Hosea. What does it mean to know God? Yada is the word used for describing knowledge, but it signifies sexual union as well as mental and spiritual activity. So we have an example of Yada. Genesis 4:1. We read, "Adam Yada, Eve, his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain." Here it means an intimate relationship. Yet, its meaning can be enlarged by referring to a total relationship, emotional as well as sexual. So we can translate this verse, Adam attached himself to Eve, his wife. In Exodus chapter 2, 24-25, we read that God saw the people of Israel and God knew their condition, yada. But the meaning is he had pity on them. Hosea conceived the relationship between God and Israel in terms of marital love. That's why the title of our topic is Hosea, God's Love. So, it is not just about right action, but about a feeling for each other on the part of those involved. It is not just about legal obligations, fulfilling commandments, but about inner attitudes as well. So when Hosea says you do not know God, he means you do not have sympathy, feeling for God. There may be a head knowledge, but no attachment, no involvement, no commitment to God. And so the prophet asks, what is the use of ceremonies when our hearts are far from God? And he wants to stress, attach yourself to God as Adam attached himself to Eve in Genesis 4:1. Conclusion. In the New Testament, the words of Hosea appear few times. For example, Christ uses his words to stress the primacy of mercy over sacrifices. You know the famous statement, Jesus tells the Pharisees, learn the meaning of the statement, I want mercy, not sacrifices. That's quote from Hosea. And Saint Paul and Peter use his words to prove that the Gentiles, together with the Jews, are now the people of God. We have in Romans chapter 9 a quote from Hosea within the context of Paul's mission to Gentile. So, Romans 9:25 and 26. He quotes Hosea. Those who were not my people, I will call my people. So, who were not God's people before? Gentiles. Now they are God's people. And her who was not beloved, I will call beloved. Again, the same thing. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, Gentiles, there will be called sons or children of the living God. So in this way, Paul using this phrase from Hosea, explaining how the mission of Gentiles was the mission to the Gentiles was already predicted long time ago. During the crucifixion of Jesus, our Lord uses Hosea to advise the crying women of Jerusalem not to mourn over him, but over themselves and their own children, foretelling the incoming judgment upon the city, the destruction of Jerusalem. The same idea of judgment falling upon the world that opposes God and his church is taken up in the book of Revelation. And finally, the most beautiful statement taken from the prophet Hosea is brought by St. Paul into his letter to the Corinthians, and is about the defeat of death. So let's finish with this passage. It is in the 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 54, and we read, "Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?"